Throughout the relatively short history of video games, there's been a select few titles which have truly stood the test of time and are considered among the very best experiences the medium has to offer. Ranking these games is always an extremely difficult task, but we put out a form across the Retro Dodo socials asking you to do just that. And I'm here today to go through the top 10 best retro games that you voted for. If you haven't already gotten involved, then a link to the form will be in the description. So if you happen to disagree where anything in this video is placed, definitely get involved and let your opinion be known. But enough with the waffling now, let's crack on with the list. Number 10, Metal Gear Solid. We're opening this list on a high note here. Metal Gear Solid is a stealth game developed by Konami and directed by one of video games' most celebrated auteurs, Hideo Kojima. This game was nothing short of a revolution, easily being one of the single most cinematic games ever experienced at the time, with its hours of in-engine, fully voice-acted cutscenes, live-action footage which added a degree of realism to the story, and its complex plot filled with twists and turns at every corner. Beyond that though, what really makes Metal Gear Solid great is the actual gameplay. From moments of tense, high-stakes sneaking in a high-security military facility, action-packed boss battles which often feature puzzle elements, and who could forget about all of those fourth wall-breaking sections like needing to look at your physical game case to discover a code to progress the story. Metal Gear Solid is a wild ride that remains one of my favourite video game experiences of all time. Number 9, Final Fantasy VII. From one PlayStation classic to another, Final Fantasy VII is easily one of, if not the, most beloved JRPG of all time. Even if you disagree that this particular entry is the overall best, it's hard to argue that it had the most impact. Just like some of the earlier entries in the series, the active time battle mechanic returns here. This makes fighting enemies feel more dynamic and adds a degree of tension to all of the encounters. If you were indecisive and wasted time in a battle, there's a good chance that your enemy might have attacked you twice in a row or hit you faster than they otherwise would have, and this was a great way of improving the pace of typical turn-based combat. Outside of the fighting though, you also had a fully 3D world to explore, which ditched the typical fantasy theming of the older titles, and went for a more industrial setting where an evil corporation is stealing the life force of the planet for their own gain. Everything from the gameplay, story, audio and graphics come together harmoniously to create what is easily one of the greatest video games ever made, and it 100% deserves a spot on the list. Number 8, Pac-Man. Now here's a true video game icon. Pac-Man is potentially one of the single most recognisable video game characters of all time, and you're bound to have had some kind of experience with something Pac-Man related, even if you've never played the original arcade game. That's just how ingrained into society he's become. While the gameplay presented in the original Pac-Man appears quite simple, it's actually got quite a lot going on under the hood, and only players who take the time to notice all of the small details will become experts. Each ghost actually has their own distinct way of tracking Pac-Man down, with Blinky, the red ghost, chasing after you directly, Pinky and Inky, the pink and cyan ghosts, trying to cut you off, and Clyde, the orange ghost, being the unpredictable one who sometimes runs away from you but sometimes pulls a 180 and will come after you directly instead. It's only by knowing these patterns and being able to predict the ghost's movements that the strategy of Pac-Man comes into play and it begins to get truly addictive. It also features one of the first examples of a cutscene in video games, with these funny little sketches playing out between levels which show Pac-Man interacting with the ghosts in several different ways. This demonstrated that Pac-Man and his ghostly enemies were more than just pixels on a screen. They were something with actual personalities, and this was refreshing at the time, with lots of outlets reporting that Pac-Man was the first true video game character. Number 7, Tetris. Honestly, I'm quite surprised that this isn't a bit higher on the list. Along with Pac-Man, Tetris is one of the video games. Titles that are so absolutely essential to the medium of games that the industry would probably look very different had it not existed. The impact of Tetris can't be understated, with several versions of it being among the highest selling games ever made. It seems like everyone has played some kind of variant of this game at some point in their lives. The beauty of Tetris is that it's actually quite simple. All you need to do is make randomly assigned blocks fall down the screen and connect to each other in such a way that they create full lines, which then make those lines disappear, thus creating more space on the screen for more blocks. The more lines you create and the more you can get in a row, the more points you get and the faster the blocks will start to fall. It sounds easy enough, but it can be infuriatingly addictive because you're constantly wanting to beat your high score. Plus, the randomized elements of which blocks you get, in what order you get them, and where you actually place them makes it infinitely replayable. What helped Tetris become even more of an addiction than it already was the Game Boy release. This gave you a way of taking it wherever you wanted and even allowed you to give it to other people for a turn and get them hooked on it too. Number 6, GoldenEye 007. Finally, we have an N64 title to talk about. Despite showing its age slightly in terms of the controls, GoldenEye is still one of the most celebrated first-person shooters ever made. It was amazing to see the amount of people who were excited to experience this again when it released on Nintendo Switch Online and Xbox Game Pass back in 2023. This was the complete package. Not only did you have a lengthy single-player campaign to blast your way through, which actually has a surprising amount of variety with its different objectives and multiple ways of approaching situations. Will you go in all guns blazing or opt for a more quiet and stealthy approach? The choice is yours. Add on the beloved multiplayer modes and GoldenEye cemented itself as one of the greats. Because the N64 had 4 controller ports, it allowed for some seriously intense split-screen matches to take place. And GoldenEye wasn't messing about in this area. Quite honestly, the variety on offer here surpasses most brand new games releasing today. Number 5, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. You had to have known it probably wasn't going to be long before everyone's favourite blue hedgehog turned up on this list. Yes, Sonic 2 takes the number 5 spot, and deservedly so. Not only is Sonic up there with the most recognisable game characters of all time, but his second outing is arguably his best. It took the speed of the original game and designed levels which could better show this off, with less of an emphasis on slowly navigating around platforming sections, and more so on blasting your way through action-packed set pieces, with accurate jumping resulting in more fluid movement through the level and potentially even allowing you to bypass certain obstacles. The new spin dash ability allowed Sonic to pick up momentum from a standing position, which helped increase the pacing, and the addition of Tails as a playable character added even more new stuff, with him having the ability to fly for a short period, act as a CPU-controlled helper when you play as Sonic, or even be controlled by a second player for some co-op gameplay. Need I also mention the soundtrack here, which is just as incredible as when it was first experienced back in 1992. The funky tunes of the Chemical Plant Zone will forever be planted in my head. Number 4, Super Mario 64. You just knew that this one had to appear at some point. Everyone has already talked about just how great Super Mario 64 is, and I for one have to agree with them. Super Mario 64 was such a revolutionary title, and it completely changed how developers looked at designing their controls, camera, and levels forever. My favourite thing about Mario 64 is the freedom the game gives you to tackle each objective thanks to its robust controls. The amount of abilities Mario has access to here is staggering, but it's not overwhelming to actually play because everything feels natural. If you run forward, crouch, and then jump, you'll perform a long jump. But if you do things in a slightly different order by running, jumping, and then crouching while you're in the air, you'll instead do a ground pound. It's so obvious now, but the way that Mario's actions dynamically change based on his position and when the buttons are pressed make this game feel so unbelievably smooth even to this day. Because the levels are so vast and objectives can be tackled in a non-linear fashion, it makes it feel like you can just go off and explore. You just do whatever you want and you're always going to come across something interesting. Add in the extra abilities provided by the unlockable caps, the amazing soundtrack, and the variety on offer with boss enemies, slides, underwater sequences, and everything else the game throws at you, and it's easy to see why this is a classic. Number 3, Pokémon Red and Pokémon Blue. I mean, this obviously had to be here. Pokémon is the single biggest media franchise in the world, currently worth $88 billion and is easily one of the most recognizable media brands across the entire world. But it all started here with Pokémon Red and Blue for the Game Boy. Despite the hardware it was on, the original Pokémon games were actually pretty massive adventures. Not only did you have a lengthy story to go through which took you through a large world with loads of differently themed areas, but unlike most other RPGs, you didn't just have a small party of characters to play and fight as, but 151 different monsters to catch and use in battles, each with their own stats, strengths and weaknesses, and evolution lines to consider. On top of that, you had some seriously fun multiplayer elements where you could battle a friend or even trade with them, and in order to fully complete your Pokédex, this trade-in was actually mandatory because certain Pokémon were only available in a certain version of the game. Plus, some Pokémon would only actually evolve after you traded them with a friend. The designs of the original Pokémon are among the strongest in the entire series, and each one is iconic and beloved in its own way. And even with how much the franchise has evolved since, the original games still hold up and are worth revisiting. Number 2, Super Mario World. This right here is probably one of the tightest 2D platformers you could ever hope to play. The controls are responsive, the level design is unmatched, the theming of each area is distinct and memorable, the power-ups change up the gameplay in ways that keep it feeling fresh, and the music is sublime. What I appreciate about this title over some of the newer Mario entries is that the later sections of the game actually become quite challenging. This makes it feel like the game actually fully expands on all of its gameplay concepts and is massively rewarding to complete for the player. Some of the newer Mario games are somewhat lacking in this area, and even though they're awesome experiences in their own right, they just don't have the same degree of satisfaction that Super Mario World gives you. Of course, you've also got the fantastic music, graphics, and controls, but then add in all of the secrets to discover and the fact that this is where Yoshi, the best Mario character, made his debut, and you've got one of the greatest games of all time, which is second only to Number 1, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Yes, the top spot on the list is rather unsurprisingly taken by Ocarina of Time. Despite it being the obvious pick though, I would still maintain that it's deserving of its place on the throne. This game pretty much laid the groundwork for every single open world game that we see today, with its expansive field area and surrounding locations which are filled to the brim with collectibles, side quests and main objectives. This was one of the first games of its time that truly blew me away with the scale of it. We had seen massive RPGs long before this, but here we had a game that felt more involved. You didn't come across an enemy and then go into a separate battle screen to defeat them in turn-based combat. It was all done in 3D space in real time with a lock-on system that's still used in games today. You actually felt like you were truly exploring the world and beating the monsters in one seamless experience, and there was nothing really like this before. This is also where Nintendo seemed to get more serious with Zelda lore, with a much more complicated storyline which features elements of time travel just to make things even more confusing. The characters here are some of the most memorable of the entire series, and many of the species that made the debut here are now mainstays of the franchise. The tools that Link gains access to are used in some incredibly well designed puzzles, and there's so much to do around every corner that it feels like it's never gonna end. When it does eventually end though, you've still got loads of side activities to do, like finding the Skulltula tokens, filling up your hearts to get maximum health, and maybe even tracking down the Big Auron's sword if you haven't done that already. Everything about this adventure is incredible, from the music, gameplay and graphics, and even things like the combat and camera, which have severely dated in a lot of other games from this era, still hold up remarkably well. You've probably heard people gushing about this game for such a long time at this point, but if you've never played through all of Ocarina of Time, you really owe it to yourself to play the whole thing at least once. There's a reason why this is the Zelda title that most often gets referenced in the later games. This is the benchmark for the other games to hit. But there we have it, the top 10 retro games as voted for by you. Now if you do happen to disagree with anything on this list, definitely get involved with the Google form that'll be linked in the description below. And if you're wondering where some of the other classic retro games were placed in this ranking, then definitely make sure to check out the article version of this video where we break down the top 25 retro games you voted for. A link to that will also be in the description. For now though, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more retro content coming to your peepers very soon, and check out our Patreon, which, surprise surprise, is also linked in the description. This is a great way to support us directly, and you also gain access to some Dodo extras too. For now though, I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.